Welcome to the perpendicular bisectors lesson. Perpendicular bisectors combine two things that we know and love, perpendicular lines and bisectors. So remember, in order to bisect a line, it can't just be a line, it has to be a line segment with a definite beginning and a definite end, because if it's a bisector, we're going through the middle. Because when we bisect something, we're cutting it into two congruent pieces. So our first vocabulary word is perpendicular bisector. This is the line perpendicular to a line segment through its midpoint. And a midpoint is simply the point in the middle of a line segment. In coordinate geometry, we find the midpoint using the midpoint formula, which is x1 plus x2 divided by 2. Then you have the comma because we are finding a point, and then y1 plus y2 over 2. And then our answers are coordinates, so we put them in parentheses. Essentially, if you remember back in algebra, or even before that, whenever you were finding the mean or the average of a set of numbers, you would add them all together and divide by how many numbers you had. And that was telling you what was the middle of that set of data that you had. For the midpoint, you're taking the two extremes of your x values, adding them together and dividing by 2 because you're finding the average between the x values. And then we do the same thing for y, and that's what's getting us to the midpoint. So in examples 1 through 3, we are finding the midpoint. So I suggest by starting with writing out your formula because it helps you to memorize it. Plug your values in carefully. So in my first coordinate, I have 8, negative 2. 8 is my x value, negative 2 is my y value. Because it's my first coordinate, I would call 8 x sub 1 and negative 2 y sub 1. In my second coordinate, where I have negative 4 and 10, I would call negative 4 x sub 2 and 10 y sub 2. Then we can plug those into the formula. And then after that, we just have to evaluate. So I have 8 plus negative 4, which would be 4. It's still over 2 because I did not divide yet. Then I have negative 2 plus 10, which is positive 8. Also over 2, and then my final step is to divide. And that makes 2, 4 my final answer. So 2, 4 is the midpoint of a line segment that has the endpoints 8, negative 2 and negative 4, 10. So I didn't even really explain that before, but these points that they're giving you for your examples, they are the endpoints of a line segment. So let's do this again. In number 2, we have negative 3, 5 as our first coordinate. So we can call this x1, y1. And negative 7, 6 for the second coordinate, so we can call it x2, y2. And then write out your formula. And then substitute. And then evaluate. So then our final answer is negative 5, 5.5. The 5.5 you could have also left as 11 halves. Both are good. Now pause the video here and complete example 3. Check your work. If you got negative 2.52, you are correct. So that was for finding the midpoint, and that's just one step of finding the equation of a perpendicular bisector. So when we're looking for equations of perpendicular bisectors, our first step is to use the given endpoints and find the midpoint of the segment. Our second step is to find the slope of the segment and its negative reciprocal. Remember, your negative reciprocal is what is going to make your line perpendicular. And then our final step is to use the new slope and the midpoint to find the equation of the perpendicular bisector. So here at this step, we're only looking for b because that will be our y-intercept. So in our fourth example, we are trying to find the equation of the perpendicular bisector when the endpoints of the line segment are 8, 2, and 0, 6. So our very first step is to find the midpoint. So to find the midpoint, I take a look at my endpoints. So we have 8, 2, that would be x1, y1, and 0, 6, so that would be x2, y2. And then I'm going to use the midpoint formula to find the midpoint. So pause the video here so you can practice. If for the midpoint you got 4, 4, you are correct. Our next step is to find the slope. So slope formula we talked about in the lesson on equations of lines. Slope equals y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. Pause the video so you can practice finding slope. So if you got the slope is negative 1/2, you are correct. When we convert this to a slope to use for a perpendicular line, we are getting positive 2. For our last step, we will be finding the equation of the perpendicular bisector, and for that we are going to use y equals mx plus b, and we are going to use the slope for the perpendicular line and the point for our midpoint to fill in x and y. So again, this is something else that we have practiced in previous lessons, so pause the video to practice on your own. And if you got y equals 2x minus 4, then you are correct. Let's try this again in example 5. So find the equation of the perpendicular bisector. The endpoints of the line segment are -1, +1, and 7, -5. So to recap, we had 3 steps. First was to find the midpoint. Our second step was to find the slope and then convert it so that it was perpendicular. And our last step was to write the equation of the perpendicular line. So for the endpoints, -1 would be x1, +1 is y1, 7 is x2, and -5 is y2. So pause the video now to find the midpoint, the slope, and then the equation. If for the midpoint you got 3, -2, you are correct. Now you're ready to find the slope. If you got -3/4 as the slope, you are correct. So now what would be the negative or reciprocal of -3/4? If you said that it's +4/3, you are correct. So I like to put the little perpendicular symbol in front of the slope so I know which one to use when I get to step 3, the equation. If you got y equals 4/3 x minus 6, you are correct. Number 6 is different because instead of giving you the coordinates of the endpoints, they're giving you a graph. The graph actually helps us to shorten one of our steps a little bit and helps to save us a little bit of time. So the first thing that we need is a midpoint. So they may not have told us what the coordinates of A and B are, but we can figure them out. A is at -7, -4, and B is at 8, 1. If you got that your midpoint is 1/2, -3/2, you are correct. The one thing I forgot to mention that's kind of cool about having a graph is you can sort of estimate where the midpoint is. Some graphs you might even actually be able to tell where the midpoint lies exactly. This one would be a little bit complicated to do that because of the fractions. Step 2 is to find the slope. So you could absolutely go through and do your slope formula, but when I have a graph, I like to count my slope out. It makes it easier and faster. So look for 2 points like these where you see that the line is going through a corner, and that means that it has a definite coordinate. And this is where we can count the slope. So remember, the slope is always rise over run. So if I go up 1 and then to the right 1, 2, 3, that's my slope. So my rise is 1 and my run is 3. So my slope is 1/3. And remember that if I want a slope perpendicular to that one, it needs to be the negative reciprocal. So my slope would be -3. And then our final step is to find the equation. If you get y equals -3x for your answer, you are correct. And because we have this graph here, one way that we could check this is to graph the line. So my line starts at the origin because I have no y-intercept, so it means it's at 0. And a slope of -3 means that it goes down 1, 2, 3, and then to the right 1, down 1, 2, 3, and then to the right 1. And there's my line, and so I'm able to see that it did come out so that it's perpendicular and it is going through the middle of AB. All right, our last example is number 7. We're writing the equation of perpendicular bisector of CD shown in the graph. And for this one, we will do the same thing that we did in the last problem. But just to help you out, I'm going to put the coordinates for C and D. C is at -5, 6. D is at 2, -8, because I know it's not always easy to see what's going on in a graph on the computer screen. So remember, your first step is to find the midpoint. Your second step is to find your slope, which you can do by simply counting what's on the graph if you're able to see that. And the last step is to find the equation. If for the midpoint you have -3/2, -1, you are correct. If you counted the slope to be -2 and that the perpendicular slope would be a +1/2, then you are correct. If for your final answer you get that y equals 1/2 x minus 1/4, you are correct. And this concludes our lesson on perpendicular bisectors.